Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about my neighbor Karen who demands that I let her into my backyard. I've learned that some neighbors are perfectly pleasant, while others seem to make it their life's mission to encroach on boundaries, literal and otherwise. My experience took a turn I never expected when a woman named Karen, who lived next door, tried to claim part of my backyard as her own. At first, I thought this would be a minor disagreement, a few conversations, maybe some fence adjustments. Little did I know it would turn into a dramatic saga involving property disputes, a destroyed tree, and an outcome that would put Karen squarely in the path of real-life consequences. If you asked me even 6 months ago if I'd ever see someone arrested on my property, I'd have laughed in disbelief. But apparently, homeownership can get that messy and shocking. I bought my house about 3 years ago, thinking it was the perfect place to settle in. It's a single-story home built sometime in the 1970s. With one of those big backyards that people used to cherish for gardening. There's a wide porch that extends out from the back door and leads to a generously sized yard dotted with trees, oak, maple, and even a peach tree that someone planted decades before I arrived. One of the reasons I specifically fell in love with this property was because of the lush greenery. Having grown up in a cramped condo, I've always wanted space to grow my own vegetables. Maybe set up a grill for cookouts. My dream was to create a personal oasis where I could escape after a long day at work. My immediate neighbors to the right and across the street were friendly from day one. They congratulated me on the purchase and occasionally gave me suggestions on local services, like which plumber was most reliable or which diner served the best weekend breakfast. It wasn't until a few months into my residency that I even learned about Karen, who lived to the left of my place. Apparently, she had lived there for the better part of a decade, but never cared to introduce herself. I took it as a sign that maybe she was private, just not the type to mingle. Little did I know her silence was a prelude to something bigger. One late Saturday afternoon, as I was putting up some bird feeders near the fence, I heard a voice call out, "Hey you! Can I talk to you for a minute?" It was Karen, leaning over the fence. She had short, curly hair and a stern expression, not exactly a grin of neighborly warmth. I put down my tools and went over to greet her. She launched into her request almost immediately. "I need to expand my garden, but my backyard is too small. I see that you have more than enough space, so I wanted to know if I can access your yard whenever I want to place some of my own raised beds. I'd like to bring a small storage box too for my tools. It wouldn't take up too much room." At first I thought she was joking. Who demands that sort of thing right away? Especially when we hadn't even shared a casual conversation before. Without hesitation, I politely declined. I tried not to sound rude, but there wasn't much of a debate to be had. My yard was my property, and her request was simply out of the question. I told her that while I appreciated her enthusiasm for gardening, I wasn't comfortable giving her free rein to my land. She glared at me, retorted something under her breath about neighbors needing to help each other out, and stormed back into her house. I was unsettled but shrugged it off, thinking maybe she was just having a bad day. Over the next few weeks, I'd catch her occasionally peering from her window while I was out mowing the grass or watering my plants. My closest friend, Damien, visited a few times during that period, and he joked that it felt like we were being watched. It was an odd vibe, but I tried not to dwell on it. After all, I had my own life to focus on. A new position at work that demanded overtime, a sister who was recovering from a surgery and needed occasional help with errands, and a half-finished backyard project that I wanted to complete before the cooler months set in. I didn't have time to worry about a neighbor who might just be a little off-putting. Everything changed a few weeks after her initial request. I was driving home from visiting my sister when I spotted a tall wooden plank leaning diagonally against my fence on my side of the property. It blocked the entrance to the side gate, the one I used to bring in bags of mulch or to take my lawnmower out. As I got closer, I realized there was a huge branch. No, it looked more like an entire limb from one of my oak trees, resting on top of the plank. It seemed like someone had hacked off a significant chunk of my beloved oak. The cut was fresh, the wood still glistening. My heart sank. Trees were one of the main reasons I chose this house, and seeing one of them harmed like that was heartbreaking. I parked my car and rushed over to the mess. Sure enough, it was no accident. Someone had taken a saw to the tree, severed a limb, and positioned it in such a way that it jammed against my side gate. I looked for any signs of who might have done this, and the only clue was Karen's voice calling out over the fence, "Maybe now you'll learn to respect your neighbors." She was standing there, arms folded, with a smirk that made my stomach turn. I asked her, "Did you do this?" And she replied, "You left me no choice. You denied me access. Now you see how it feels when you can't enter your own backyard." That comment alone felt like a bizarre logic puzzle, as if harming my property would somehow make me relent and just hand over partial access. My anger rose, but I tried to keep calm. I told her this was vandalism and that she had no right to cut any part of my tree. She snapped, "That's not your tree, it's on the property line." This was downright untrue. The trunk was clearly centered in my yard, and I had the original survey documents to prove it. I told her to stay right there while I called the police. I'd never dialed 911 with such certainty before, but in that moment, it was crystal clear that a crime had been committed. The dispatcher took my information and asked if the person was still on the scene. I affirmed that she was. A patrol car arrived within 20 minutes, and I could see Karen was a bit startled. She probably thought I wouldn't follow through. 2 officers got out, walked into my backyard, and surveyed the damage. One of them questioned Karen about the incident, while the other asked me for my side of the story. Karen's defense was nonsensical. She claimed she had the right to prune my tree since it extended over the fence. The officers weren't buying it, especially since she left the cut limb barricading my gate. Moreover, the cut had been made entirely from my side of the yard, which quickly disproved her story about just trimming a branch hanging over her property. This was considered property damage and potential trespassing. Karen started to raise her voice at the officers, insisting that I was the one causing trouble by denying her fair use of adjacent land. The officer who was speaking with me shook his head and took notes on a small pad. The second officer tried to calm Karen, but her voice reached a fever pitch as she yelled about how she was forced to do this to teach me a lesson. The officers exchanged a look that seemed to say, "She's incriminating herself." Within minutes, they had her in handcuffs. She was yelling, "This is unfair, you can't do this to me." But they definitely could. She'd committed vandalism, possibly trespassed, and caused me financial harm, considering the cost it would take to heal or remove the damaged tree limb and fix the gate access. As the officers escorted her to the patrol car, I felt a strange mix of relief, shock, and sadness. I never wanted to see a neighbor hauled away in handcuffs, no matter how aggravating they were, but there was no denying that she had crossed every imaginable line. An officer stayed behind to finish taking my statement, documenting the damage with photos, and advising me on next steps. I was told I could press charges for property damage, or at the very least file a report that would likely lead to a court summons. I didn't need much convincing. Letting this slide would only embolden her, and clearly she needed a reality check. Over the following days, I reached out to a local arborist to examine the tree. He explained that while the limb was severely cut, the tree might recover with proper treatment. I'd have to remove the damaged part, treat the open wound, and keep an eye on it for signs of infection. The cost estimate was in the hundreds of dollars, which was frustrating, but I was glad it wasn't going to require an entire removal. That tree was an anchor in my yard, something I cherished, and it broke my heart to see it harmed because of petty neighbor drama. Meanwhile, I spoke with a lawyer friend named Sophie, who was well-versed in local property laws. She walked me through what to expect if Karen was charged. Given the evidence and the fact that the police witnessed her meltdown, there was a good chance she could be convicted of vandalism, plus any additional charges the prosecutor might see fit. I provided the police report, photos, and even a copy of my property survey. Karen remained in custody for a short time, then was released. A court date was set for about a month later, which gave me time to gather all the documentation I needed. During that waiting period, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible. I was swamped at work, where I had to onboard 2 new employees to my team. At the same time, my sister's recovery was going well, so I spent occasional weekends helping her around her house. Whenever I was home, I was a bit on edge. Karen's property was ominously quiet. I saw no cars in her driveway most days, no lights on at night. A few other neighbors whispered rumors that she might have gone to stay with a relative until the hearing. That was perfectly fine with me. I just wanted peace. The day of the court hearing rolled around, and I was equal parts nervous and resolute. Karen showed up looking tired and agitated. I sat down with my lawyer friend and waited for our turn. When we were called, the judge asked for statements. The prosecution displayed the photos of the damage, the police report detailing her bizarre admission about wanting to teach me a lesson, and a copy of the property survey. Karen tried to argue that she was just trimming a branch that intruded on her yard, but the evidence clearly showed she cut from my side. The judge seemed unimpressed with her explanation and informed her that property owners have the right to trim branches only up to the property line, and doing so in a destructive manner, especially from the neighbor's side of the fence, could constitute criminal damage. Not to mention that placing the limb as a barricade showed deliberate malice. It was hard for Karen to wiggle her way out of that. The judge found Karen guilty of vandalism and recommended restitution for the damages done to my property. She was also given probation and mandatory community service for her actions. While it was not an extremely long sentence or anything dramatic like jail time beyond her initial arrest, it was enough to confirm that what she did wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a crime. She'd have to pay for the arborist's fees and any other costs associated with the damage, plus a bit extra for emotional distress. I felt a sense of vindication, though I also wished it had never gotten this far. After the court proceedings, Karen tried to approach me in the hallway. I wasn't in the mood for any further confrontations, but she stopped me, saying she wanted to apologize. She said something along the lines of, "Look, I was under a lot of pressure and I made a mistake." I told her I appreciated the gesture, but that it didn't excuse what she did or the months of stress she caused me. She tried to slip in one more request, something about wanting partial access if I ever changed my mind. I just shook my head and walked away. I wasn't going to let her sweet-talk me into handing over a portion of my yard, not after she had proven she was both entitled and reckless. The next few weeks felt more peaceful. Karen didn't return immediately to her house as far as I could see. I got a visit from her sister, or at least the woman claimed to be her sister, who knocked on my door one evening. She told me that Karen was deeply ashamed of what happened. I politely nodded, though I didn't share details. This woman added that Karen was facing financial hardship on top of everything else. She seemed to be fishing for sympathy or a reduced restitution. I kindly but firmly stated that the ruling was now a legal matter and there was nothing more I could do. I wasn't about to let her walk back the judge's order. I needed to repair my yard and recoup my losses. To occupy my mind with something positive, I decided to continue improving my property, especially the backyard. With some of the restitution money, I purchased a few new garden beds, a better compost bin, and some hardy shrubs to plant along the fence line. My plan was to create a denser natural barrier, which would serve both aesthetic and privacy purposes. Damien and I spent a weekend digging, planting, and rearranging the layout of the yard. The result was beautiful. The bigger part of me wanted to ensure no further drama with Karen or anyone else about who had rightful access. It would be crystal clear that there was a boundary. If she tried to trespass again, she'd have to physically push aside a bunch of shrubs. That, combined with her conviction, hopefully served as a sufficient deterrent. About a month after the trial, Karen resurfaced. I spotted her from my kitchen window, pacing near the fence line in her yard. She appeared to be measuring something with a tape measure, possibly thinking about constructing her own raised beds or a shed. I hoped she'd use her own property this time rather than coveting mine. Then I noticed that her yard was indeed quite narrow, and most of it was taken up by a giant patio. A small wave of pity came over me, but it didn't last long when I remembered how she'd handled the situation. There were so many alternatives. She could have tried container gardening or even joined a community garden. Instead, she chose vandalism. One evening, I was returning from a run at a local park when I found a letter slipped under my front door. At first, I worried it might be something threatening, but it turned out to be from Karen. It was an apology letter, more detailed than her brief hallway encounter. She wrote about how she never wanted to take my property, but just borrow it for gardening. She admitted she handled everything poorly and was prepared to accept any hostility I felt. Interestingly, she also wrote a passage about how, as a child, her parents had taught her that neighbors should share resources, like collectively maintaining a backyard orchard. That was evidently her rationale. But times are different, laws are explicit, and you can't simply demand your neighbor's land. I wrestled with whether or not to respond. Ultimately, I decided not to. The matter was settled legally. The damages were being paid back, and I had no reason to further engage. My mother once told me that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone who has wronged you is simply leave them alone. They'll either learn from their mistakes or continue down a self-destructive path. I had done my part by standing up for my rights. If she was genuinely remorseful, great. If not, that was her burden to bear. That sense of finality might have ended the story had it not been for one last hiccup. My property extends about 20 feet beyond my fence in the back. leading to a small wooded area that belongs to me but remains mostly wild. It's a natural buffer that slopes downward toward a drainage ditch. One afternoon, a neighbor on the other side, an older gentleman named Tomas, noticed a few wooden stakes in that wooded area. He knocked on my door to ask if I was planning to build something there. I said no, absolutely not. Curious and slightly alarmed, we went out together to examine them. Each stake was spray-painted with a fluorescent orange tip, as if someone was demarcating a boundary. My suspicion was immediately drawn to Karen. Even though she had a normal yard on her side, I couldn't dismiss the possibility that she was now eyeing the back portion of my property. Since Karen's property didn't border that back area directly, there were 2 other backyards in between. This suggested she might have collaborated with someone else or was looking to purchase an easement. This was a brand new twist. I decided to get in touch with a surveyor just to confirm no one was encroaching on my land. The official measurements confirmed what I already knew. That land was mine, and no one else had any rightful claim to it. So I did what I had to do. I removed the stakes, documented everything with photos, and let the local zoning office know there was a potential encroachment situation. I also installed a small wildlife camera facing that patch, just in case anyone tried to come back and plant more stakes or do something shady. I didn't relish the idea of playing detective in my own backyard, but these experiences taught me I had to be cautious. A few days later, I saw Karen walking down the street with some other woman, presumably a friend. They passed in front of my house, and Karen shot me a look that was half embarrassment, half defiance. I caught a snippet of conversation. "Yeah, that part behind his fence, I was hoping." Then they moved out of earshot. I shook my head. Had this woman learned nothing? Still, I didn't see any new stakes after that. Nor did I hear more about her possibly wanting the back portion of my property. Maybe the brush with the law made her realize she was on thin ice. Aside from that incident, my life began to settle back to normal. I tried to focus on positive projects, like adding new plants around my porch and painting the fence a fresh coat. I started volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, finding solace in helping animals find homes. My mother visited for a long weekend and was delighted by how nice the backyard looked. She especially loved the oak that had been cut, noticing it was still thriving despite the missing limb. I told her about the fiasco with Karen, and she was equal parts horrified and fascinated. She reminded me that some people, once they set their sights on something, just can't let go. Perhaps that described Karen perfectly. A couple of neighbors on the block became more friendly toward me after hearing about the court case. Some of them had run-ins with Karen in the past, though never so severe. Apparently, she once tried to commandeer a small strip of land on the other side of her house to plant tomatoes, claiming it was a communal area. That caused a mild conflict, but no one pressed charges. Another neighbor mentioned that she's always had a knack for confrontation, particularly with new residents who haven't learned the unspoken rules of the block. That revelation made me a bit sad. I love community spirit, and I never wanted to be at odds with the people who lived around me. But by now, it was obvious that Karen was the instigator, not me. It was around this time that I reconnected with an old high school buddy, Kevin, who had recently become a licensed contractor. I invited him over to look at my property, hoping to build a small gazebo near the peach tree. As we walked around, I explained the fiasco and my concerns about property lines. Kevin suggested installing a more robust fence along the left side and possibly adding security cameras if I was worried about any future attempts at intrusion. He also suggested that if I ever had the funds, I should think about clearing the underbrush in the back area and establishing a clear boundary line with a small row of posts. It would not only be aesthetically pleasing, but also make it impossible for anyone to claim confusion about where my property ended. That idea stuck with me. I decided to budget for it in the following spring. Meanwhile, life carried on. Karen occasionally lurked around, but mostly stayed away from direct confrontation. The restitution checks came in on time, which covered my arborist's bills and some of the improvements I'd already made. Once or twice, the checks were short by a small amount, but I let my lawyer friend handle that detail. I was not about to jump into another personal argument with Karen. The legal route had proven to be the only effective method of dealing with her. As the months passed, I started to feel more secure. The story was becoming part of my past, something I would recount to close friends over dinner, an example of how not to handle neighborhood disputes. I began exploring other opportunities in my community. I joined a local hiking group, attended a couple of block parties, and even hosted a backyard barbecue for a few coworkers and neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal. It was a beautiful gathering with kids running around, fresh burgers on the grill, and a relaxed vibe. Some folks raised an eyebrow at the mention of Karen, but I assured them it was all taken care of. That might have been the final chapter if not for a bizarre rumor that reached my ears a few weeks later. Damien told me that someone had been going around the neighborhood, suggesting that I had unfairly pressed charges against a poor woman. At first I brushed it off. Then I learned that Karen was behind it. She was trying to repaint the story in her favor, telling folks she had just trimmed a branch to keep her yard safe. According to her twisted version, I overreacted and weaponized the legal system. The rumor didn't get much traction among people who knew me and had seen the evidence, but it was still annoying. I politely set the record straight when asked, showing them the photos of the tree limb left as a barricade. One Sunday afternoon, a woman named Miriam, who lived 2 streets over, approached me at the local farmer's market. She said, "I heard about the incident with the tree, and honestly, Karen has been spinning quite a tale. But my sister's in law enforcement, and I heard there was an actual conviction." I told her the truth, explaining how the police found her in the act and that she basically confessed to wanting to teach me a lesson. Miriam shook her head, clearly unimpressed with Karen's excuses. She wished me luck and said, "Don't let her drag you back into any nonsense." Over the winter, I finally had Kevin install a few improvements that would make the property line crystal clear. We put in a row of sturdy posts across the back, each bearing a small reflective marker. While we didn't do a complete fence extension, the slope in that area was pretty steep, we did enough to show that it was my land, not open for debate. The wildlife camera remained in place, quietly capturing images of squirrels and the occasional deer. No sign of more orange stakes or any new sabotage. I exhaled a sigh of relief whenever I walked back there to inspect the area. Meanwhile, Karen's yard stayed mostly as it was. I noticed she had put in a small bed of vegetables right along her fence, where the sun was strongest. She also cleared out some of the old junk that had been piled in her backyard for ages. Perhaps she finally decided to make the best of her own space. One day, I even saw a couple of people, maybe a landscaping crew, delivering soil and mulch to her place. Part of me was glad that she was channeling her energy into improving her yard instead of scheming about mine. Spring arrived, and with it came fresh blossoms on the peach tree, a renewed sense of optimism, and a final closure to the property drama. I heard through a mutual neighbor that Karen had completed her community service hours at a local food bank and was no longer on probation. She kept her head down, probably trying to avoid more trouble. Since the court order was still in place, she couldn't harass me without risking further legal consequences. Life at last went back to the calm I had envisioned when I first bought this house. One day I was walking to my car when Karen was pulling into her driveway. She got out and looked over at me. For a moment, our eyes met, and it felt like time slowed down. There was no aggression in her face, just a resigned sadness. She raised her hand in a small wave. I gave a polite nod. Neither of us spoke. That silent interaction felt more profound than any conversation we'd had. It was as if we both acknowledged the past, recognized the boundaries now set in stone, and decided to maintain a distant peace. In the end, the entire ordeal taught me several lessons about home ownership, boundaries, and the importance of standing up for your property rights. Had I allowed Karen's demands to go unchecked, who knows what she might have done next? By asserting my rights through the legal system, I not only protected my own property, but also prevented her from running roughshod over others in the neighborhood. While I take no pleasure in the fact that she faced arrest and a conviction, it was a necessary outcome for the destructive choices she made. Property laws exist for a reason, and if you push someone too far, particularly by damaging what they cherish, there's going to be a reckoning. I'd be lying if I said the experience didn't leave me a bit jaded. I now triple-check any new neighbors who move in, introducing myself but also making it clear where my boundaries lie. I keep records of property surveys handy and maintain a watchful eye for any signs of tampering or encroachment. I don't want to live in a fortress mentality, but I also refuse to be naive. If someone tries to infringe on my land again, I have a plan. Document everything, contact the proper authorities, and let the law do what it's supposed to do. Despite the drama, I love my home more than ever. The backyard has become my sanctuary, with a thriving vegetable garden, a cozy gazebo, and that splendid oak tree, still standing proudly, albeit missing one limb. My friends and family come over for summer barbecues, kids chase each other on the grass, and we all marvel at how peaceful it is now. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of Karen through her window, and I wonder if she's reflecting on her past mistakes. Maybe she learned a valuable lesson too. I hope that anyone who hears this story realizes that entitlement can manifest in surprising ways, even from someone who lives just a fence away. But the important thing is knowing your rights, asserting them calmly, and using proper channels to resolve conflicts. Violent confrontations or ignoring the problem never really helps. In my case, the law was squarely on my side. While the aftermath was stressful, it ended with a clear affirmation that you can't simply bully your way into someone else's property. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences involve a pair of handcuffs and a judge's verdict. In the grand scheme of things, I feel I came out of this ordeal stronger, more aware, and perhaps a tad more guarded. I'm thankful for the neighbors and friends who had my back. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the biggest twists come not from distant enemies, but from the folks living right next door. If I have one final takeaway, it's that a peaceful neighborhood is worth protecting, even if it takes a serious stand to maintain it. My home is my sanctuary, and now everyone knows it's off limits unless I willingly invite them in. Friends, thank you. See you soon.